History is a story told in time. To make sense of the past, we need a way to measure it, to place events in a sequence. For centuries, the Western world relied on a dating system that pivots around a single monumental event. We are talking about the labels we attach to years. BC before Christ, AD Anno Domini, Latin, in the year of the Lord. Today, you might see different letters. BCE, before the Common Era. CE, Common Era. The year numbers stay the same. 2025 CE is the same as AD 2025. Why have two systems to say the same thing? This is not just a trivial debate over letters. Who owns history, how we tell its story, who that story is for? It's about culture, religion, and the search for a global inclusive language. The words that frame our timeline influence our perception of what is central and what is peripheral to the grand narrative of civilization. Understanding this shift reveals a broader change in how modern society sees itself and its past. The goal here is to explore that topic. We will dig into the origins of the BC AD system, tracing its journey from a religious calculation to a global standard. Then we will examine why people push for BCE CE arguments for neutrality. To understand our modern dating dilemma, we must travel back in time to the 6th century, to a world where timekeeping was a far more complicated and local affair. There was no single universally accepted calendar. People often dated events by the reign of their current ruler, such as the 5th year of the reign of Emperor Justinian. This made correlating events across different kingdoms and centuries a headache for chroniclers and historians. It was in this context that a Scythian monk living in Rome, known as Dionysius Exiguus, or Denis the Small, was given a rather technical task. His job was to calculate the dates for Easter for the coming years. Dionysius was working with an existing system of tables that dated years from the start of the reign of the Roman Emperor Diocletian. However, Diocletian was infamous for his brutal persecution of Christians, and Dionysius was uncomfortable with honouring the memory of such a tyrant. In his work, completed around the year AD 525, instead of counting from Diocletian's reign, he would recenter history on the incarnation of Jesus Christ. He calculated a new starting point, which he designated as the year of Jesus' birth. He labelled the years following this event Anno Domini, a Latin phrase meaning in the year of the Lord. This is the origin of the AD we know today. It is a common misconception that AD stands for after death. It actually marks the years of the Lord's life and the era that followed. Interestingly, Dionysius himself never used the term before Christ or BC. His focus was on the Christian era. The concept of systematically counting years backward from AD 1 was a much later development, one that did not become widespread for several more centuries. His primary innovation was to establish a new year one. Modern scholars, using more detailed historical and astronomical data, generally agree that Dionysius's calculation was slightly off. Most historians now place the actual birth of the historical Jesus. This is a fascinating irony. The very system designed to pivot on Christ's birth does not, in fact, align perfectly with it. Nevertheless, the system Dionysius created was not about perfect historical accuracy. It was a theological statement, an attempt to place Christian history at the very center of time itself, erasing the memory of a persecutor and replacing it with the figure of a savior. Dionysius Exiguus's new dating system did not take off overnight. For a couple of centuries, it remained a relatively obscure tool used by a handful of scholars and by churchmen mainly for calculating the date of Easter. Its journey from a monastic table to the default dating system of the Western world was slow and gradual. The key figure in popularizing Anno Domini dating was the Venerable Bede. Bede's work was a bestseller of its time, copied and circulated through monasteries across Europe. His reputation made the use of AD credible. Crucially, Bede was one of the first to count years before AD 1 using the Latin term ante incarnationis Dominicae tempus. This became the forerunner of BC, before Christ. His single timeline history provided a model for national and universal histories. Over centuries, BCE AD spread from scriptoria to royal chanceries. The Carolingian Empire under Charlemagne helped standardize its use in official charters. By the High Middle Ages, it dominated legal records, administrative records, historical records. The Renaissance revived interest in the classical world of Greece and Rome. Scholars applied BC AD to ancient history, solidifying it as the timeline for all history. By the age of exploration from the 15th century onward, BC AD was entrenched. The BC AD system reigned supreme for over 1,000 years. However, as the world entered the modern era, science, religion, society began to challenge old certainties. The Enlightenment in the 18th century championed reason and secularism, and some thinkers began to feel uncomfortable with a dating system so explicitly tied to a single religion. The idea of a common era or vulgar era, with vulgar simply meaning common or ordinary, started appearing in the writings of some scholars. The real momentum for change built up in the 19th and 20th centuries. This was driven by several factors. First, the rise of academic disciplines like archaeology. World history brought scholars into contact with a vast and ancient human past that had no connection to Christianity. For a Jewish historian writing about the Second Temple period, using before Christ could feel inappropriate and anachronistic. For a sinologist studying the Shang dynasty, using before Christ could feel inappropriate and anachronistic. They sought a terminology that was more neutral and respectful of the non-Christian cultures they studied. Thus, before the Common Era, BCE, and Common Era, CE, began to gain traction in academic circles. Second, the 20th century saw a dramatic increase in globalization and multiculturalism. As societies became more diverse and as international bodies and collaborations became more important, there was a growing desire for a public language that was inclusive of all people, regardless of their faith. Publishers of textbooks, museums, and academic journals began to adopt BCE, CE as a matter of policy. This shift was not a conspiracy to erase Christianity, as some critics have claimed. Rather, it was a response to a changing world. Proponents, such as those cited in major academic-style guides like the Chicago Manual of Style, argue that BCE-CE is simply more accurate and appropriate for a global and multi-faith audience. The system keeps the familiar numbering of the Gregorian calendar, which is a practical reality of global life, but reframes it in secular, inclusive terms. The rise of BCE-CE is not about changing the timeline itself, but about changing who the timeline is for, from a specifically Christian us to a more universal us. Split image, medieval manuscript with AD, or modern museum plaque with CE. Does it really matter whether we write 586 BC or 586 BCE? The event it describes, the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem, the destruction of Solomon's temple, remains the same. On one level, the change is purely semantic. The numbers do not move. And yet, we should not underestimate the power of language to shape perception. The labels we use are not neutral containers, they are frames. They tell us what to focus on and what to consider important. The choice between these two systems can subtly alter the story we think we are telling about the past, and it can change the way our audience receives that story. Using Before Christ and Anno Domini centers the narrative around the life of Jesus. It creates a timeline with a single dramatic pivot point, implies everything before led up to this event, and everything after flows from it. But applied to world history, it can impose a Christian-centric structure on other civilizations. The story of the Zhou dynasty in China, the Olmec civilization in Mesoamerica, has no intrinsic connection to first-century Judea. Using BC can feel like forcing their stories into someone else's timeline. The adoption of BCE/CE attempts to de-center that perspective. It flattens the timeline conceptually. Instead of a peak, it presents a continuous line. Year one becomes simply a convention we inherited. This can encourage a more pluralistic view of the past. 500 BCE was also when Confucius was teaching, the Buddha was teaching, the city-states of Greece were flourishing. The Nok culture was creating terracotta sculptures. All happening concurrently with equal validity. This matters in education. In a diverse classroom, using BCE/CE can be a small but significant act of inclusion. It signals to a Jewish student, a Muslim student, a Hindu student, a Buddhist student, or a non-religious student that their heritage is not a prelude or footnote to someone else's sacred history. It helps create space where different civilizational stories are examined on their own terms. The debate is not just about sensitivity, it is about historical methodology and the intellectual goal of understanding the past in its multi-threaded glory, rather than forcing it into a single, predetermined narrative. Despite the steady march of BCE/CE through academia and public institutions, a walk through a bookstore or a glance at many popular history websites will show you that BC and AD are far from dead. The older system remains widely used and vigorously defended in many quarters. Its persistence is not simply a matter of old habits dying hard. It is rooted in deep convictions about tradition, culture, and faith. For many, BC/AD is not a problem to be solved, but a heritage to be preserved. First and foremost, BC and AD remain the standard in explicitly Christian contexts. Churches, theological seminaries, religious publishers, individual believers continue to use the terms because they reflect a core tenet of their faith, that the incarnation of Jesus Christ is the central event in human history. For them, using Anno Domini is an affirmation of belief, a way of marking time that is spiritually meaningful. To replace it with Common Era would feel like a dilution of that truth, an unnecessary concession to secularism. From this perspective, the dating system is not just a tool, but a testament. Beyond a purely religious context, BC/AD persists due to cultural inertia and tradition. For centuries, it was simply the way things were done. Countless millions of books, documents, inscriptions use the old system. Many people grew up with it and see no compelling reason to change. They might argue that everyone knows the system originates from Christianity, but its modern use is largely conventional, stripped of its religious weight. For them, the push for BCE/CE can look like political correctness run amok, an attempt to fix something that isn't broken. They might ask, why not also change the names of our days, months, many of which are named after Roman gods, Norse gods? Finally, the system is often retained in popular as opposed to academic history writing. Authors and publishers may choose to stick with BC-AD simply because it is more familiar to a general audience. The historian Tom Holland, for example, has argued eloquently for retaining BC-AD, stating that to pretend the Common Era is somehow neutral is a fiction, as the entire numbering system is still fundamentally Christian in origin. He argues that keeping BC-AD is more honest, as it forces us to acknowledge the profound and undeniable influence of Christianity on Western civilization, including on the very way we measure our history. The debate is thus framed not just as faith versus secularism, but also as historical honesty versus a potentially misleading neutrality. So, where does this leave us? The debate over how we label our years is a living one, and it is unlikely to be resolved anytime soon. We currently exist in a state of dual usage. BCE and CE have become the standard in most academic, scientific and international settings, a nod to a globalized and pluralistic world. At the same time, BC and AD hold strong in many religious communities, in popular culture, and among those who value the weight of tradition. Neither system is likely to vanish in the near future. They will continue to exist side by side, each carrying its own set of historical and cultural implications. What this situation demands of us is not a final verdict, but a greater awareness. The most important thing is clarity. Whether you are a student writing an essay, a museum curating an exhibit, or a historian publishing a book, the responsible approach is to be explicit about the system you are using. A simple note in an introduction. All dates are given in BCE, CE, or this work uses the traditional BC-AD notation, is an act of intellectual courtesy. It prevents confusion and acknowledges that a choice has been made. It shows respect for the reader and for the complexity of the topic itself. But perhaps the conversation should go deeper than just the letters. Some scholars argue that fixating on BC-AD versus BCE and CE distracts from a more fundamental challenge. The challenge of breaking free from a Eurocentric view of history altogether. Even with the neutral BCE, our timeline still pivots on a year derived from European Christian history. Truly globalizing our understanding of the past requires more than a change in notation. It requires us to actively teach and learn the histories of China, India, Africa, and the Americas on their own terms, using their own chronologies and periodizations where appropriate, and seeing them as central to the human story, not as footnotes to the history of the West. In the end, the choice of which system to use often comes down to context, audience, and purpose. There is no single correct answer that fits all situations. The debate is a symptom of our ongoing efforts to negotiate how we live together and talk to one another in a world that is both smaller and more diverse than ever before. So, the next time you see a date, take a moment to look at the letters that follow it. They are more than just a convention. They are a small piece of a very big story. Which system do you find more compelling, and why? Your answer is part of this long and fascinating conversation about how we choose to mark our time.